This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. This is your friendly reminder to again like and subscribe, to rate and review the podcasts, particularly in iTunes and the Apple Podcast Store. That makes the podcast more visible for any future listeners. Also a reminder to please engage with me online with the hashtags #SecularGrace, #HumanismIsPeople, and #deconversion. On to today's episode. My guest today is Tom. He is the producer and subject of a podcast called Hiding in Plain Sight. Tom describes the podcast as a search for meaning and a re-examination of the things that are surrounding him, hiding in plain sight. Things that he's ignored or not paid attention to. The podcast is broken up into series, and the first series is about Christianity. Tom lives in the UK, where there is greater secularization than in the US. So, as Tom describes it, Christianity is all around him and yet ignored. So this is his attempt, as a non-believer, to understand what it's like to seek meaning as a Christian. The podcast is incredibly well produced. They've produced their own music that is available for purchase. I highly recommend the podcast. I want you to go check it out. We'll have links in the show notes. You can find his podcast at hipspodcast.com. HIPS for Hiding in Plain Sight. And now I give you Tom of the Hiding in Plain Sight podcast. Tom, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Really good to be with you, David.
Tom, you have this very, very interesting project called In Plain Sight. Let's just hear the 2-minute overview of what that project is.
Yeah, so I've released a series called Hiding in Plain Sight, and it's basically about a search for meaning in things forgotten and overlooked. And they're not necessarily things that everyone's forgotten and overlooked. They're things that I personally have forgotten about or overlooked. And the first series is all about Christianity. So I've done a 6-part sort of thinking out loud series about me putting on Christian clothes, walking in Christian shoes, and seeing what it's like to live a small piece of what a life as a believer might be like. I'm a non-believer. I don't believe in God. I'm not a Christian. I don't have a religion. So I thought it'd be kind of exciting to explore how is it that people find such meaning in these other ways of spending their time. So and it's hiding in plain sight because it's a show about stuff that's all around me. I don't really venture much further than maybe 10, 15 miles from my house, the whole show for this first series. So it was really important for me. It was just stuff that I could be doing, but I'm not doing. And that was the really important thing. Like there's a setup at the start of the show where I'm kind of on a train. I'm talking about my journey on a train every day. And it's sort of like, what if I got off and did that today? It's a kind of show based on that premise of what if I got off a stop earlier and went to church? It's that type of sort of setup, if you know.
Right. And it's fascinating. I think we spoke offline. What is interesting is the comparison to a couple of things that were important for me for my process of coming out of religion. It's kind of a mirror image of that. One of which was Julia Sweeney's Letting Go of God. She does this spoken word play that is, you can get the DVD. Used to be on Saturday Night Live. She's a comedian.
Right.
And she talks about in the process for her, it was one day when she basically said to herself, what if I just put on the not believing in God glasses for just a minute, just to see what it looks like? That was kind of this break for her where she could see the world in a different light. And then secondly, there's a guy by the name of Ryan Bell who did an entire year, a project called A Year Without God, where he was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, had been for quite some time, and he decided, you know what, I'm going to explore the world as without God. What does that look like? And so what I was fascinated by your project is kind of a mirror image of that. You're saying, I don't really have a faith, but what does it look like to be a Christian?
Yeah, it's that's interesting. It's an interesting thing, and obviously for you, like you've had those touch points with people who've done something similar before. But I often find that people, or at least in my experience of it so far, is people are sometimes surprised that you're willing to do that.
Right.
Like it's almost like, I've got a good friend of mine who's an atheist, he's a non-believer, and he kind of jokes to me, but I know behind the joke he's also kind of secretly worried that I'm smuggling in Christianity, and I'm not actually willing just to admit it just yet. And it's almost like a disbelief, like, why would you go to church? Why would you even bother putting on fancy dress clothes or whatever, however you want to put it, and trying something like that, unless you're really just a Christian who's just hasn't come out yet,
That is really funny. Yeah. I have to admit, when we first got in touch with each other and I heard one of your episodes, that I've been kind of thinking, how am I going to approach this conversation? Because there's, on the one hand, I think this is really compelling what you're doing. And on the other hand, kind of the hard atheist in me was jumping up and down like, no. So I can kind of relate to your friend a little bit. And what I've tried to think about is trying to match the level of humility and honest seeking that you clearly portray in your project. And just, I'm going to be honest with you, at times when I was kind of leaping out of my seat, with the hard atheist in me was like
screaming down your
that's right. That's right. So let me start with probably the least original question. I'm sure you get this all the time. You've kind of answered it, but did you find God in this process?
I mean, you could get all sort of French philosopher about that, couldn't you? And really break it down. I mean, to answer your question as honestly possible, is no, I didn't find God. I'm not a believer. I'd still be someone who doesn't believe in God. But there is a way that you could look at it and say that I did find God in so much as I developed a new understanding of what I think people mean when they say they found God. And I certainly, did that old cliche. I've arrived back at the start, still as a non-believer, but different, if that makes sense. So depending on how much time you want to go into that question, there's a kind of short answer, which is no, I didn't find God. But there's maybe a bit more of a sort of nuanced answer, which is to some extent yes, but it doesn't mean I'm a believer or I have a belief in the supernatural. But I kind of think I got to know the Christian message, and I guess within that is God, in a new way, and appreciated things about it that I really genuinely didn't think I'd appreciate going in. And that was some of the real sort of like golden nuggets for me.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue. My next question is, what did you find the most compelling in this journey?
That's interesting. So I think it breaks down into sort of like three groups, sort of three like buckets, if you like, of things. There's the philosophy, there's the kind of there's the cultural side of things, and then there's also like the community. Like those are the kind of three big things. I say starting with the philosophy, I think that I say philosophy quite deliberately because I think all of the messages and the ideas within Christianity, obviously they're religious ideas, but when you're a non-believer, you kind of have to do some legwork because you can't just take them as Christians take them because you don't believe. So in importing them into your life, you've got to kind of turn them into sort of mini philosophies, if you like. So an example would be one of the things I just kind of got obsessed with was the sort of prodigal son. And this idea of grace, which is why I thought you might like episode 5. Yes. So when we were talking about it, that's the one I signposted you to because I obviously the title of your show and stuff. Yeah. And obviously, some of the stuff you put out is often about this idea and how you can take that idea, and even if you strip away some of the religious stuff, which you have to, you've got no choice as a non-believer. You have to strip that stuff away. You're still left with something that maybe is a new way of thinking about something. And I've got to be honest, I got to the age of 34, which is when I started this, which is obviously a short time ago. I couldn't have actually told you what grace was going into it. I don't think I really had a good definition of what grace was. I heard people use it and I kind of understood what it meant to be gracious, but I didn't have it nailed down as someone getting something that they didn't deserve.
Right.
And when you say it like that, it almost sounds kind of naff. And it sounds maybe even like something that you wouldn't want to sign up to. But when you play it into a story like The Prodigal Son, and then you think about, okay, how does that apply to how I view immigration? Or how does that apply to how I treat my wife? Or how does that apply to, all these other things that as a non-believer are important to you? you start to sort of see some of the that was just really beneficial. So there was kind of some of the philosophies were really interesting, and one of the great things you get to do, because you don't believe in God, is you kind of get to pick. You get to sort of strip away the things you don't really like, and you get to keep the ones that you don't, so that you at the end of the day, I kind of curated for myself the learnings from Christianity that I thought were really meaningful. And so I've ended up, I think now, having done the show and then having to edit the show and then think about the show and, do all that sort of stuff, and that sort of double reflection, if you like, I've left with a set of ideas that and things that I think about in life that I didn't have going in.
Right. I've got a book recommendation for you. Henri Nouwen's Return of the Prodigal Son.
Right.
That's an amazing book. I read that about probably 4 or 5 years before my deconversion. And in that book, a couple of things. One, you can hear, you could feel Henri's struggle with his own faith, with the supernatural elements. But the other thing that he does that's just profound is we tend to think of the prodigal son from the prodigal son's perspective. I've done bad. I don't deserve my father's love, and the beauty of that from that perspective. But he tells the other two people in the story their perspective. He talks about the prodigal son's brother and the jealousy and the one who has always done right and feels entitled. And my read through at that time, I was struck so much by the prodigal son's brother's perspective. And I realized how I was treating some people in my life, some loved ones in my life, as if I was right and they were wrong, and just really was a profound impact. And I mean this in the most humanist way, right? That, non-religious point of view, but just, I needed to treat people differently. And then thirdly, he talks about from a father's perspective of truly just loving unconditionally other people.
Yeah, it really is a sort of like, for anyone who's got close family ties or a surrogate for family, maybe good friendships that are kind of similar to family ties. It really is a powerful story. And I've got two brothers. Mm-hmm. And so again, it was like this double resonance for me. And I even mentioned, I have a similar experience of it to you. And I mentioned that in the episode where I talk about the prodigal son, is I really resonate with the older brother story, because even though I was the youngest brother in our family, I think I mentioned it in the episode. I remember on Christmas Day, sort of, doing a rough mental maths at all the presents our parents were handing out. Yes. Just make sure that I had my fair share. It's just a really sort of tacky example, but also the things, the relationships you have with your wife and the sort of the day-to-day kind of personal relationships. That older brother, it really is as big a part of the story as the younger brother. I couldn't agree with you more. I think I almost find myself reading that bit of the story more than I do the younger brother's story in some way.
Yeah. And since we're on the topic of kind of cultural touch points, you also mentioned Les Mis in one of your episodes, and I thought that was so profound. I always have been, I cry every time I see the scene that you describe when Jean Valjean is caught after he's stolen the silverware from the priest. The cops, the gendarmes bring him back, and the priest starts stuffing his bag full of more silverware. And that is such a beautiful, and again, humanist example of grace. And it's a profound cultural expression of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, we can just stop the podcast now. I mean, me and you can let's just spend the rest of the time talking about this. I absolutely love Les Mis. And again, like sort of having done this and going back, so it was so nice that this is completely fortuitous, and maybe a recommendation back to you if you haven't seen it. Mm-hmm. The BBC, so the British Broadcasting Company, so our stuff over here. I hope you guys get it. They recently released I think it's a 5 or 6 part drama, fully produced TV series of Les Miserables, which has just come out without the music and all that sort of stuff. Okay. With the guy, one of the English actors in it, who's in The Wire, that famous sort of American TV show.
Okay,
He plays Jean Valjean, and he's unbelievable as Jean Valjean. And so I watched that shortly after I sort of finished the sort of editing for the series, and so had this opportunity to sort of watch that show, having just done this Christian life experiment. And again, it was just like seeing, you're seeing stuff that I hadn't quite picked up on, having just learned all this stuff about grace, and then seeing that series, you realize, I always knew those Christian themes were in Les Mis, but I hadn't quite realized how much of a straight line there is from some of the Bible's stories to what I guess Victor Hugo was talking about in those characters. So
Right.
yeah, it's really, really interesting.
You also mentioned looking at the Christian artifacts, as it were. So you mentioned going to the British History Museum, I believe. What did you find there? What did you find interesting about that?
Yeah, that was cool. I mean, I was reading I had this book on the shelf, and it was one of those things that kind of, you probably find this when you're doing your show, David, where you kind of, you're just knocking about reading an article about something, or you're just reading something, and you'll think, oh God, that's a really great thing for the bit I'm doing. So I was reading a book I had on the shelf, which is like the history of the world described in 100 objects. And I'd been working on, or I was in the middle of my life experiment, and I kind of came across this image, and it was an image of Jesus's face, and it was a kind of tiled image. It was a mosaic image, and I started reading about it, and it was saying how this was actually one of the first images of Jesus they think anywhere in the world. So, according to I'm no historian at all, but sure. According to the description, it talks about Jewish culture really hesitated to put up images of God, and so there isn't that many, or if any, images of Jesus in early kind of Christian culture. And it wasn't until kind of the Romans took it on board, who were obviously very used to sort of displaying their gods and the kind of pagan traditions that they come from, when they started incorporating Jesus into their culture, that then Jesus's face started becoming a thing. So anyway, in this sort of little part of the UK, when the Romans were over here, sort of in a few hundred years after Jesus has died, there's a tiled floor that they excavated in someone's villa that has a picture of Jesus, and it's, if you can imagine, it's probably 3 or 4 meters by 3 or 4 meters. This tiled head, and they sort of excavated it, and then I found out it's literally like 5 miles from my house, or 10 miles from my house, in the centre of London, in the British Museum. So I kind of raced off to see it, and then I included that. Just that little segment, if you like, that sort of snippet of my journey to go see it, because it ended up being, I ended up tying it in, I guess, the theme around it, and the sort of the nice thing about it was what I found in that exhibit was the other things around that time period, the other Roman pieces, are all very grand. And even the floor that Jesus is on, the tiled floor that he's on, is a very grand, sort of extravagant floor feature. It's of a Roman villa, which probably means it's sort of, a wealthy upper class Roman individual who's got Jesus, and he's paid someone to put this huge picture of Jesus on the floor of their house, which would have obviously cost a fortune, 1,500 years ago. And yet Jesus' image is a picture of a man with 2 nails through his head. And he looks a bit shaggy. And he's not a god with a sword and a shield, and he's not looking gorgeous and beautiful like maybe you might think some of the Roman or pagan gods would look like. So it ended up being a sort of like a neat sort of representation, if you like, of how I had started seeing Christianity in my life, or in my local community. It sort of sits awkwardly in the culture. Like Jesus kind of sits awkwardly in Roman culture. You've got the gold and the extravagant, the power, and all of these kind of Roman sort of characteristics. And then you've got Jesus sitting at the center of it, this guy born in a barn who people then worship, and they worship him not because of his status necessarily, as a human at least. Obviously, he's got a sort of religious status, I guess, which is a different thing, but his human persona is very sort of basic and humble, and I just love that idea of how even to this day, and especially to this day in British culture, Christianity is this kind of awkward other thing. It's not the mainstream anymore. There's probably less Christians in the UK than there are Christians now. it very much, even though it's wedded to our politics, because we have, Christianity woven into our politics. Unlike you guys in the States, you don't have that. But it still plays. It's sort of overshadowed by the sort of secular culture.
Yeah.
And it has that kind of similar role to what it would have had back then. So it was kind of like a really interesting. It was just a really interesting thing. I was just reflecting on that and kind of how then, as an individual, if it's not something that sits in your life, how can Christianity or should Christianity influence you in any way? I just kind of got lost in that little idea for a while and kind of found it an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting subject as well that I don't know that all of my American listeners might appreciate, but the differences between the UK and the United States. The UK, in theory, you have an official religion, the Anglican Church. So
Yeah.
you get all the Christian holidays off. You mentioned that when you talk about like Easter and Good Friday and things like that. And in theory, in the United States, we have a separation of church and state, and yet we are having, in our politics, the problem of religion affecting our politics in a way that I don't think, but you correct me if I'm wrong, that occurs in the UK. And there's this, as if the UK went through a secularization process, that the US, we're kind of teetering. It could go either way for us at this point. We could either head towards theocracy or we could head towards more secularization.
Right.
And so you truly were looking at Christianity where these cultural artifacts are all around you, but it isn't necessarily the focus of the culture. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it really is. I started thinking about it like almost like it's sort of like the afterglow of the Big Bang. Like it's everywhere, but it's nowhere. You could happily, like the sort of Good Samaritan, you could walk past Christianity every day of your life and never engage with it as a Brit, really. Of course, it influences because of the things you mentioned. We have bishops in our. I can never remember which way round it is in your politics, whether it's the House of Reps or the Senate. But anyway, we have a House of Lords, which is kind of like the sense checker for the main house.
Yeah, like the Senate, yes.
And that has bishops in it.
Right.
Right, it's the Senate. So in our Senate, we have, I think it's like 25 or 20 bishops who have fixed seats. You can imagine the outrage in the States.
Right.
If you put 50 Catholic bishops or 50, whatever, pick a denomination, if you put those guys in the Senate, there'd be outcry. But here we have it, and yet there isn't an outcry about it. And they kind of go about influencing the culture in very sort of subtle ways. And there are political issues, so that there would be things that are hot potato topics. Like, for example, faith schools is a big thing that the Humanists UK is talking about, the sort of secular movements in the UK. They are talking about, we still publicly fund faith schools in the UK, so you can get public funding if you're a faith school, and there's big controversy around that. And so there are issues, but you're right. You're absolutely right. Christianity isn't something that people are very comfortable wearing on their kind of day-to-day heart sleeves. Right. A good example would be like an example people I think would resonate with them would be like British politicians. Tony Blair never really spoke about his faith until he stopped being prime minister. Whereas most presidents, or at least that we pick up on, they never stop talking about God.
Yes, no,
they're always trying to sneak in the fact that God's, a member of their team.
Right, definitely.
And it's the opposite here. You would really struggle to find a British politician comfortable with talking about their faith. They're not closeted about it, but it's just not something they weave into their public persona. And Tony Blair never talked about it until he left.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of just British culture that you kind of keep private things private as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think my wife's Canadian, and she describes herself as being the best of both. And I think what she means there is like, the British culture maybe a little bit too reserved. The accusation of the American culture is a little bit too brash and full of itself. And Canadians are like the best of the.
They're perfect. Yeah,
that all the time.
Yes, that's great. I love that. I'm going to use that. Let's see. I definitely don't want to forget to talk about you. You meet just a fascinating cast of characters, beautiful people who are expressing what I recognize as the things that I found most compelling about Christianity when I was first coming to it. And I want to just acknowledge here that there are good things in Christianity, and there are certainly good people. There are lots of problematic things, and there's a rest to the story, obviously, that my life exemplifies. But I'd like you to talk about some of the people that you met, and how were you, impacted by them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I did meet some really interesting characters, and that's been one of the lovely things for me is to have spent time with them. It kicked off, well, right near the start of my journey, and the kind of opening lines of the whole show is about a priest that I met called Alex, and his story, I think, is the one I kind of got obsessed with when thinking about what the show could maybe be. So Alex was a lawyer, corporate lawyer in a Magic Circle law firm. So for anyone unfamiliar with law, I think most countries have a sort of set of law firms they regard as like the Magic Circle. It's not anything to do with magicians. It's all to do with like an exclusive group of very successful and influential law firms. And Alex was a partner in a law firm. So he was there for over 15 years. And he was a partner in a law firm until his 40s, as a non-believer, as an atheist, quite a sort of staunch atheist. He would have described himself as. He said he used to mock the Christians he worked with and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, his story is interesting because he has this, he had everything going for him. He kind of had the great job. Being partner in a law firm is very lucrative. You're basically winning the lottery once a year, salary wise.
Right.
I've met his wife. She's absolutely lovely. You've got 2 beautiful kids. But he describes this moment where they're on this like luxury island, this like place where it's like designed to make people happy. Yeah. The food's on tap. The sun is gorgeous. He described it as the only place he's ever been that's better than the brochure.
Okay.
And I imagine Alex had been to some pretty decent places, thinking about obviously some of the means that he would have had to go on some decent holidays. So he probably knows a good luxury island when he sees one. But the point was that he had this moment, and him and his wife both had this moment where they looked at each other and they're just like, we're not happy. Yeah. They're in their sort of, I think they were when they were going through this, I'm guessing they were in their sort of early 40s, and they realized that the problem was them. And they didn't become Christians overnight. It wasn't a sort of like a bolt of lightning moment, but there's a series of events obviously in Alex's life after that point. But anyway, he's a priest now, and he's probably in his 50s, I'm guessing. And I got to know Alex. I've only known him as a priest, but he sort of started telling me this story, and it was amazing to me because it made me think about all of the people around the world who take on Christianity from a point of not having. Why do they do that? And what meaning do they get from that? And so Alex is a really interesting story because he represented, I think, to me, all the things we're told as kids will make you happy.
Yeah.
Money, good relationships, ability to go great on holidays, satisfaction at work, all the things your school teachers, especially school teachers in the hardest communities around the country. My wife used to work in schools around London in tougher communities. All the things teachers are desperately trying to get children to achieve, right? Economically self-sustaining, meaningful relationships with people who you really like, and maybe satisfaction in a career that you really enjoy, always worthwhile, or there's some kudos or something. Alex had all of those things.
Right, it sounds like it.
And he was deeply unhappy, and his life kind of lacked meaning. So he was a fascinating character. So I met people like him. And there was just sort of that story kind of repeats itself. You'll know this, David, I'm sure, like being amongst churches, people are really keen to tell you their story as Christians.
Yeah.
British Christians stand out, I think, especially some of the evangelical churches I visited, because they're really comfortable with talking about themselves, whereas British people tend to be a little bit awkward and a little bit, we're all a little bit too much like Hugh Grant, if you've seen any of the kind of Notting Hill or Four Weddings and a Funeral films, all a little bit too much like that. So I met people British Christians who were kind of quite comfortable in telling a version of that story. So yeah, I did meet some great people, but just to make a final point about it, I don't think necessarily they're great because they're Christians, though. I didn't come away from this feeling like it's necessarily Christians are better, or in any sense Christianity necessarily makes you better, or all Christians are good people. I hope I didn't paint a picture that all Christians are fantastic, and if you become a Christian, you become a great person. I certainly don't think that. But I met some people actually who were really struggling with life. Actually, I think is what you meet when you meet Christians, and Christianity offers those people something. And I think that's the big takeaway I got, is people get something out of being a Christian. It doesn't necessarily make them better, but it adds value to their lives in some way, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. I can see that. I've actually written about this, that for me, I came to Christianity in my late teens. And at the time I was dirt poor, didn't have any prospects for college or any kind of career, when I was just totally lost, had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And that's about the time that Christianity came to me, and it gave me a prepackaged sense of purpose and something to do. So that it's compelling. Nobody's arguing that the message of Christianity isn't compelling. And for those people, I think you're kind of hinting at those people who are going to self-select to do good in the world, probably seek out that framework to find that infrastructure, as it were, to go and be good to other people.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and we can get into it, one of the, I was talking about the philosophy being one of the things. The other thing, obviously, is community. They're one of the big areas I think that I found interesting. And I completely agree with you that infrastructure, there's an amplifying effect that I think Christianity can offer people, where it can amplify effort. So if basic human cooperation, basically, you become part of a team, you can do a better job than you can do on your own. I mean, that's not a special idea for Christians at all, but Christians, because they've got this central story, because they've got a thing that combines people together, it's interesting at a time where we're stripping away and ripping some of the infrastructure out of society through scaling back our public spending in the UK. So things, big example, for people in and around London, we've closed about 500 children's centres in London over the last 10 years. Christians offer a lot of mum and toddler and dad and toddler classes, and they offer a lot of kind of provision that both Christians and non-Christians go to. And of course, they include some messages in at the end and stories about the Bible and things like that. And they of course, they have an agenda, like everyone, I think, has an agenda when they're setting these things up. But it's interesting how there's the sort of the non-public funded institutions or frameworks are having to provide and support things that we maybe more have been willing in the UK, at least, to fund publicly. So Christianity has this increasingly important role, both, I think, for non-believers and believers. And there's a conversation to be had, I think, about how comfortable we are with relying on the church to provide that stuff. Is that always a good thing? I think there's a good conversation to be had there. So it's interesting, I think, that amplifying effect simultaneously with a kind of dampening effect of the fact that we're scaling back local government in the UK. Sort of post 2007, that's been a big thing. So the church is playing a sort of an interesting role during that time. I don't know what it's like in the States, whether that's been something that you guys are experiencing as well, but certainly something that's happened here.
Well, certainly we are scaling back social services at this time. I'm not necessarily certain that the church has stepped up entirely in that role, but that happens, right? There are definitely Christian services that are out there that provide some of that role. I want to bounce off of really the key word that you're using there, and that is community. The big draw for religion in general, and we're talking about Christianity specifically, is their ability to foster community. It brings people together with a common purpose, a common sense of meaning. And the very most difficult thing I find for those of us who come out of having had faith and subsequently become secular is the lack of community, right? There's some semblance of that online, but there are problems there, as there would be anywhere. But the same sense of we're all pointed in one direction doesn't exist. It's much more like herding cats. And one of the things I find difficult is even for my own family. I have many believers in my family, and trying to say to them, give up this thing that you find meaningful and helpful and all of this community and go it alone. That just is not a compelling message. And there's only, there's certain people that are going to self-select for that. And I think that's my great worry for the secularization. Just because we don't believe in God does not mean that we don't need community and each other. And we need those infrastructure elements that seem to be missing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, David. I think it is one of my biggest unanswered questions, I think, from this whole thing is just some of my instincts around that. I don't fully know what I think about that yet, actually. I completely agree with you. I've spent some of my career working on sort of community development stuff, and so I have a small background and understanding of sort of how some of the secular versions of it work. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I have a personal life as well, so I kind of have my own kind of community of friends and things like that. I think it's a really interesting topic, and I share your worry. I don't say it's a worry, but I share your concern that maybe, and I think often some of the kind of loud or more sort of outgoing atheist pundits and commentators, I don't think there's an acknowledgement enough that there isn't a ready-made alternative.
Right.
I don't think there's an alternative. I'm really happy to be contradicted on this, or just have examples where we think it gets close to it. I don't think there's anything in the secular world that really offers the same thing that religion does. And I obviously don't mean belief in supernatural, because it can't offer that.
Right.
Even if you stripped it down to the secular elements of it, there's very few things that offer philosophy, community, and tapping into a sort of mythology and history under one roof. I can't think of anything. And you could go to a rugby club. Rugby is a bad example because no one plays rugby in the States, but actually you guys are starting to. And if you really put your minds to it, you'd be the best team in the world. But anyway, we'll get into rugby another time. But yeah, rugby clubs are a good example, because certainly in Wales, where I come from, they really are at the heart of the community. And they really do bring people together, and they're a lovely example of community places. The rugby clubs where people play sport. There's that band of brothers thing. Yeah. There's the parents afterwards, sort of all having a beer and having a good time. But it doesn't, I don't think, have anywhere near the same kind of opportunity to talk about some of the more challenging ideas that Christianity does. So you wouldn't go into a rugby club in Wales, sit down next to your mate after playing 80 minutes of smashing each other about and slipping and sliding in the mud, and talk about suffering and redemption.
Right.
I mean, they'd laugh you out of the place. So there's an opportunity afforded to Christians in the spaces that they give each other, where they can have conversations that I think that are hard to come by in other relationships you have when you're non-religious. Even I would say, I've got a great set of friends, and this is not to knock them at all, because I'm one of them. But even when me and my friends meet up, you don't always have those kind of deep, meaningful conversations. Sometimes it's quite hard to get those going because you don't see each other very often. So you don't want to talk about suffering. So you don't want to sort of bring everyone's good time down by sort of crying into your beer. But church, I saw people falling down and breaking down and crying. I wouldn't say every Sunday that I went, but I'd say a third of the time I would have spotted someone crying in the corner and someone coming up to them and putting their arm around them. It's not that socially acceptable in the UK just to burst into tears. We kind of we balk a little bit at too much emotion. We'd rather have a cup of tea and get on with it. So Christianity is an interesting place in the UK, because you're right. I think it offers something that you don't get in there's not obvious examples for me in secular. I don't know what you think about that and what that's like in the States, but I don't see that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are definitely attempts, right? Sunday Assembly, there are ethical societies, there are individual meetups and things of that. So it does exist, but it is much, much more rare than I think you described in your show how many churches in, a given mile or two, near your house. It's the same in the States. I can pass 10 churches, going 3 or 4 miles away. So nothing anywhere near to that order of magnitude exists for secular people. And so definitely I feel like that's a missing piece.
And it's and not to sort of like rub your nose into it in it too much, David, but one of the things we get here, which maybe, I don't know if you get it in the States, because obviously it's a new world sort of place, but we've got churches that have been around for 600-700 years.
Yeah.
And so it's almost impossible for something to replicate something like that. There's an episode in episode 2 where I go into Winchester Cathedral.
Yes.
That thing was built in, I think, something like 650 AD or something.
Right.
And then it took its final form. It was sort of had its last sort of major makeover in sort of like 1500.
Yeah.
So you've kind of got this depth of tradition that actually is impossible to replicate, and you can't replicate it. And so, there's a British broadcaster who went on to, I don't know if you listened to the Unbelievable show.
I wanted to talk about that. Yeah.
I mean, a great sort of Christian non-believer show for anyone who's on either side. It's absolutely great. But there was a British broadcaster who went on there recently called Melvin Bragg, who does a podcast called In Our Time, which is, if you haven't listened to it, it is an absolute must. It's a gorgeous podcast. But he's very famous in the UK. And he went on there recently. He's a non-believer, but talked with such passion about the tradition, the actual Bible, the written words in the Bible, and what we'll lose by being a little bit, if we're a little bit fast and loose with kind of some of those traditions, we'll lose something. And I think in the UK, we have such a tradition that, it makes me feel a little bit uneasy when I hear non-believers talk about it so casually. Yeah. Because even though I am a non-believer, I sympathize with some of their sentiment around some of the tricky parts of religion, but a failure to acknowledge some of the kind of really embedded qualities of it, I struggle when we don't always point them out.
Right.
I think we should at every opportunity try, at least at minimum, to point out some of the obviously good qualities about what we have. You can argue the toss about some of the middle ground and some of those things like the community elements and the philosophies. There's a grey middle ground there that you wouldn't expect every non-believer to get on board with, but there's some no-brainers, I think, that we really probably should rally around a little bit.
Yeah. So you mentioned the cathedrals. Again, this is, you're totally right to rub my nose at it. The Americans probably don't appreciate what it's like to go to Europe, to go to the UK and look at a cathedral that is, millennia old. Like it's just, I went to a service as an atheist at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And
amazing.
You walk in and the genius of the architects of just, you feel a sense of awe that, you cannot help. This is a human reaction to something that is so grand and so large. The architects of these cathedrals have literally built a place to experience awe, right? And obviously believers go in there and they say, well, God is present. But what I'm suggesting is that it is a human experience to experience awe. When we go and we look at a waterfall, or we look at a rainbow, or the horizon, these things that we recognize are larger than ourselves, and we have this moment of awe. So I think you talk about awe a little bit in your podcast as well. What was your experience? I know you did some contemplative services as well. What did you find awe-inspiring?
Yeah, I'm quite glad you've rubbed my nose in it now, because I've been in London for 10 years and I've never been to a service at St. Paul's. So, okay. So that's a really cool thing that you've had the opportunity to do, and I should do it. I mean, St. Paul's is literally on my doorstep pretty much, and I mean, I could get on the train and go there now. It's crazy. I've never done it, so that's really cool that you've had the chance to do that. Yeah, those holy spaces are interesting. I speak to a guy, talking about characters that I meet. I speak to a guy called Charlie in episode 2, who starts to talk to me a little bit about sort of the different types of churches, and he talks about high and low church, which is kind of a really crude way and not a very sort of intelligent way to break up churches. But they're much more subtle than that. But he did that for me because I think he wanted me to try and understand the different types of church experience you can get.
Can I jump in just really quickly? I think for my audience, liturgical and non-liturgical is probably
right.
the better way to describe it. So yeah.
Okay.
So we're talking about the same thing, high and low. High is liturgical and
okay, cool. Yeah. And so I spent a bit of time in what you describe as sort of high church. And they tend to sort of create this sort of holy space. It's often in an old church, so and there'll be things like incense, and there'll be sort of choral music, which has this kind of eerie, ethereal sort of quality to it. English choral music's a real traditional thing, I think, developed by sort of ancient monks and things like that. And so I kind of had that opportunity to kind of just sit in some of these places and think about some of these traditions. One of the most interesting ones I had was over Easter period, and it was interesting because it ended up being quite hard and quite difficult, and I was struck by the sort of the gumption of the church putting something like this on. It was like a 2-hour meditation, and it was called the Meditation on the Cross, and it was basically people sitting on really hard wooden 2 hours basically doing nothing and being asked just to sit there, and they would break it up sort of every 45 minutes with a little bit of liturgy or a little bit of thinking about the cross and Jesus' experience on the cross. But you were asked essentially to meditate for 2 hours, and I was kind of struck by those moments because one, I don't usually engage with, I've done some meditation before, but I don't really find the time often to do that sort of stuff, certainly not for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And to have an organization or to have something that wants to engage people, be brave enough to put on something that was going to be so hard and so unappealing for people is one of the things I think in the UK, at least, I don't know what it's like in the States, the church has the ability and the bravery to do. It's not interested also often in the kind of the market and how many people it's going to get through the door by what it puts on. You know, there would be a temptation for every church in the UK to become very engaging and kind of, you know, bring everyone in through like having baked cookies at the door, letting the smell waft out, bringing people in off the streets,
right,
making everything quick and snappy, and you can get everything through your phone, or, you know, you could really modernize in that way. Some of the things I loved, which as a result become some of the things that feel most striking or awesome, are some of the things whereby they don't really care if you like it or not. Yes. Like a big empty church with nobody in it, with, you know, 20 choral singers at the front, basically singing just to you, almost by your own, in Winchester Cathedral.
Right.
They've not bothered spending any money on the marketing. Maybe they should. Maybe there's an argument they should, but they haven't. But they'll do it anyway. Or they'll put on a 2-hour meditation, and 5 people will come, and they'll run it anyway. And there's just this, I'm just really struck by some of those things. We're in a society now where it feels like we count the cost of everything, and everything's got to be engaging, and everything's got to have 20 likes, or everything's got to have, you know, a return on investment. The church can play a role that cuts through some of that stuff and holds on to some of the kind of other ways of doing things, maybe because it gets funding by some other means, and you know, it's self-funded in many ways and things like that. But you can experience things that are hard to come by elsewhere, I think, as a result.
Yeah. Again, I think my humanist perspective on that is that they are designed to foster that awe, right? That it's a recognition of how humans connect with one another and how we experience that. I also wanted to get to very quickly, you spend a fair amount of time talking about really, as a non-believer, experiencing what prayer is like. Tell me about that. What did you find interesting about that? What worked, what didn't?
Yeah, I'd say out of everything I did, it was probably the most hit or miss.
Okay.
Obviously, because you know, I don't want to paint a too vivid a picture for your audience, because they'll click off the show. But you know, I was sitting there in my pants half the time, and pants in the UK is your underwear, of the floor of my house, essentially talking to the ceiling. You know, because if you don't believe in God and you're praying and you're using the words like a Christian would use, which is obviously the guidance I got on prayer. I spoke to priests about it, and I spoke to people I know about it, and kind of followed the kind of the pattern, if you like, or some of the ways of doing it. And so it was really hit or miss. Often I felt ridiculous. There's a bit in the show in episode 2 where I actually play out one of my prayers. And I even felt awkward about putting it in the show.
Yeah.
It is actually probably the closest the show gets to being a little bit cringy, I think, in some ways. I don't know if it is like that to listen to as someone who isn't me. I find that a bit cringy to listen to.
I definitely just wanted to say, you expressed that in that episode, and again, it feels honest. You're being honest with your audience that you don't believe, but you're really giving it a try. You're really doing, you know what I mean? So I definitely think that even believers who are listening to that would recognize that you were doing it in humility. You were not trying to make fun of it. It was an honest attempt.
Yeah. And also, I think I also had the opposite instinct, which was not just to do it in humility because I didn't want to make fun of it. I also didn't want people to feel like I was kind of, so I don't know, disingenuously doing it when I really did believe, or something like that, where I was kind of pretending like I didn't believe, and actually I pray all the time, or something like that. So the whole prayer thing, I think, was probably one of the hardest bits for me. The silver lining in it is time by yourself, even if it is with your own thoughts. And I'm imagining Christians get the same sort of thing that I get when I sit by myself and talk to the ceiling. They get ideas and images and instincts and maybe nudges. Me, like you, David, probably would chalk that up to just kind of your brain and the different levels of consciousness and subconsciousness and how your brain works and all that kind of stuff. That's still my view of what is happening when you sit by yourself in prayer. But you do end up talking to yourself a little bit, and there are little moments of clarity within that. And so it is something that I've come away with. I probably knew this before, but I would have never sat and prayed. An appreciation of just taking 5 minutes for yourself, and if you're talking to a God, great, that's fine, but it doesn't have to be. It can be just to a sort of maybe like a bigger idea, or just a reflection on something. I did a confession which I recorded and put in one of the episodes, and that was revealing, because the things that were on my confession list, there was a couple of things I didn't think would be on there, and I ended up with, I think, a lack of like bravery or something like that was on one of them. And I was like, I had no idea I was thinking that about myself going in. Now a Christian would say God told them that, or
Right.
God revealed that to them, that they should be thinking about having more courage in their life. My takeaway is that maybe I was thinking about that without thinking about it for a while, and it took the 10 minutes on the floor in my pants in my room for me to realize I'd been thinking about that for 2 months maybe.
Yeah.
So I kind of found that whole thing, that without pouring down a rabbit hole of kind of, complete sort of self-interest, I found that sort of side of things interesting.
Yeah, I find that when I talk to people who were religious, who have deconverted, that is one of the things that they miss the most, is that not only does it feel like it's comforting, it also feels like they are actively doing something, right? If something's not going well in their lives, it feels like they can do something about it. They can go pray. And I recently had a friend of mine on to talk about meditation, which I have to be honest, I'm not good at. But there's so much to be said about just self-reflection, about taking a moment, like you say, and being quiet and removing the distractions and having intentional time to just let your brain think for a while. And it might be amazing what it comes up with.
You said something interesting there. Maybe we come back to it later because you might have other stuff to talk about. But just to hold on to is, you said when your friend didn't become a Christian, when they stopped becoming Christian, they stopped praying. And it just to hold on to it, because I'm interested in that idea of and also maybe your experience, because obviously you've gone from being a Christian to non-Christian, about why someone would feel the need to stop praying. I think the answer sounds obvious, but I'm increasingly interested in that idea of why don't we do some of these things anyway?
Yeah.
And what stops us from, just because we don't believe in God, what stops us from engaging with it? I'm really interested in that question as a result of this. And so, yeah, whether we want to come back to that or not, but just
no, let's go with that. I think that's a super provocative question, and I'll do some more self-referential here. I think the third or fourth episode was Matt Cook. You might really enjoy this. And this is again a non-believer who went to just practice the spiritual practices of Christian. He called it the year of living Christianly. It's actually very parallel to your experience, but he prayed every day. He read the Bible every day. He did these things as a non-believer. For myself, I can say that I always had an uneasy relationship with prayer to begin with. There was always a lot of pressure, performance pressure to this thing that we're not supposed to talk about, that's supposed to happen privately in the closet, is, Jesus specifically says, go and pray to your heavenly Father where no one can hear you.
Right.
It's the hypocrites stand on the corner and praise God, right? And yet there's this performance sense in at least evangelical Christianity where you're expected to have quiet time, for some significant amount of time every day, and, read your Bible and prayer. So I always had this really uncomfortable relationship with prayer. And one of the last books that I read, Christian books that I read prior to my deconversion, was one of my favorite Christian authors, a guy named Philip Yancey. And I describe it this way. It's basically 400 pages of him twisting himself into knots, trying to say that prayer is meaningful, but at the same time acknowledging, it really doesn't change God. It really doesn't change the world. It changes us in some way, which is really humanistic. And so in that sense, for me personally, let me try to match the openness here. My mom passed away about 8 months after my deconversion. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty heavy time. It was a time in which I really missed having a sense of God's presence, having a sense of something out there. And about a year after she passed away, I went on a road trip with her ashes to her favorite beach to spread her ashes. And I consciously, effectively talked to myself. I talked to my mom, who I know couldn't hear me. And you could very much call this prayer, and I felt ridiculous. And yet it was incredibly cathartic. It was this, even the fact that I was doing a road trip, mom would have loved that. And I had a contentious relationship with my mother. It was, I could express some anger. I expressed my grief. But it was the closest thing that I think I've done that is prayer-like since my deconversion. And so I definitely see the value in that kind of thing. And at the same time, on a day-to-day basis, I would feel ridiculous, right? For me, running is this very meditative thing for me. I think through work, I think through my relationships, I think through the podcast, and just big ideas, right? Whilst I'm running. And so that for me provides that need. And I would I would honestly feel kind of silly if I sat down in the room and did what I used to think of as prayer. But that's just that's my personal story. So.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I think I had a similar feeling about the kind of absurdness of some elements of the sort of the religious sort of experience. But I increasingly have this sense, and I don't know how you feel about it, that there's certain elements of the absurd that are probably useful, that we already embrace and we probably don't realize we do. I think of almost everything through the lens of sport. I love sport, and when you stop and think about sport, certainly contact sport, which I played a lot of when I was growing up as a kid, it's kind of ridiculous. It's kind of absurd. We don't think of it as absurd because it kind of goes under the radar. We don't think of it as kind of being as crazy as sitting down as praying. But running around on a rugby pitch for 80 minutes, clobbering your friends in the ribs with your shoulders.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is essentially what rugby is. You're basically booting people and clobbering them and then smiling about it and enjoying it. I think it tells us a little bit something about how our biology and our psychology is wired for the absurd a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've noticed in my experience that sort of touching on some of the absurd bits of Christianity helped me sort of think about where else actually I engaged in absurd things and maybe didn't realize it, and made me feel a little bit more comfortable about actually maybe trying. I think that happens anytime you step out of your comfort zone, you become more comfortable to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the great things about, they talk when you go away on youth retreats with kids and you take them kayaking and mountain climbing and stuff like that. They talk about never be in your comfort zone, never be in your danger zone, always be in your stretch zone, right? It's this kind of this in between place where you're learning. There's risk, but you're not sort of panicking, or you're not sort of really out of your depth. And I think for me, like to wrap on the prayer bit, and similar things to prayer, like singing in church, or singing the actual words that Christians sing, which is all about Jesus. And I don't believe in that stuff. I don't believe he's king. I don't believe all of that bit. But even in doing that, which might be ridiculous, you do get something out of it, probably because we're human beings and we like to be connected to stuff and we like to feel things and all that sort of stuff. So why you got a kick out of going on a journey with your mum, even though it was complicated for you, I can completely get why that was meaningful. It makes complete sense to me.
Yeah. I just wanted to jump on, you're talking about singing in your podcast. You're talking to Justin Brierley of the Unbelievable podcast, and talking about music and how that connects people and brings people together. And again, I was struck by the atheist in me was jumping up and down, like, that's a human thing, right? Like we really want to, the rituals are still important for people. The big moments in our lives, births, weddings, funerals, and singing is one of those things that is music in general. It's just such a huge part of what it means to be human that, of course, that brings us together. I find it hard to sing the Christian songs now, and I miss that. I want to, but I have this sense of it's just not true. It's, there's this famous saying that Christians don't tell lies, they sing them. And there's one particular song in the evangelical churches is like, God, you will never let me down. And I think, really, that's quite a statement. Maybe that's not entirely true. So anyway, I just thought that the idea of singing was an interesting concept.
Yeah, and music is a big part of Christianity and obviously the tradition. It also became a little bit of a theme in the show because obviously we spent time working on the music for the podcast and all that sort of stuff. So I wanted music to be, because I just love music, religious aside and all that sort of stuff. Right. I just really into music. So I wanted whatever I was making to have a sort of musical backdrop to it, and to talk about music and things, any excuse to talk about music, really. So I'm interested by Christian music. I'm interested by the fact that a lot of it is really bad, and Christian rock is, there's very few examples of Christian rock that I really like. So I'm interested by it, but nevertheless, like, when you're there with 100 other people on a Sunday and they're all belting it out, I just found myself singing along. And kind of getting involved with it anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it is the music side of stuff was fun.
So I want to hit just a couple more topics. So similar to the idea of prayer, you also spend some time just really sounds like for the first time looking at the Bible, and in particular the Gospels. What did you find striking? Did you learn something new when you were going through, the first time seriously taking a look at these stories?
Yeah, I did, and I went to Catholic school, so it was funny because it certainly wasn't the first time I'd opened a Bible, and we did like religious studies at school, and it was all about Christianity because it's Catholic school, so they don't teach you about anything else, so they kind of only focus on one religion.
Yeah, yes.
And so I got a religious education, if you like. I wasn't much of a student, so I didn't do a lot of listening. But I used to draw out the stories, and I can remember some. So I had some reference points going into it. What I had no idea about, and I can genuinely say this, I had no idea really about the fact that the whole Christian message isn't about being a good person. Mm-hmm. I thought Christianity was, the Old Testament was kind of crazy, and Christians kind of didn't, kind of wanted to ignore it, really. This is my preconception.
Right.
They kind of wanted to ignore it because it's a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe there's some good stories in there, but let's largely ignore it. And then Jesus comes along and basically gives you a blueprint for how to be a good person. That was my thinking going in. Where obviously, depending on your denomination, it probably cuts a few different ways. But the a lot of the mainstream thinking, at least here in the UK, is there's this long, big story going from Genesis right the way through to the end, and it's all about a kind of rescue mission for the earth and for mankind, and that idea of renewing kind of heaven, that Belinda Carlisle idea
Yeah.
of heaven's a place on earth. That's kind of a bit of a summary of the way some of the Christians I met thought about what earth is. We're living in like a broken version of what heaven should be like, and that's our job, is to sort of restore it. And when Jesus comes back after his resurrection, and after if in sort of the end times, if you like, the Christians will be reborn, using their earthly bodies into that new world. All of that stuff, that kind of that storyline from Genesis through to the Revelations to John, I didn't know. I didn't realize how that tracked along. So that was eye-opening. And then Jesus' role within that as this kind of unique man God that can bring about that, and the kind of substitutional elements and all the kind of the beliefs about what the resurrection actually means. And Jesus is kind of the symbolism around that I found quite interesting. So yeah, I really got a kick out of sort of geeking out on some of that stuff. Appealed to me a little bit.
It's interesting you mentioned the Revelations to John, and because a lot of what motivates any given denomination is their eschatology, is what they think the end times is. So there's a huge disparity between those people who think that the rapture is this literal thing, and that God's just going to yank the good people, the believers, out, and everyone else is just going to be left in chaos and suffering, from those people with an eschatology that say that we need to build God's kingdom on earth here and now. So you kind of, sounds like you were exposed to the latter of those. And that really has a huge impact in the way that Christians interpret what it means to be a Christian. So it turns out that eschatology is this really important factor on how Christians behave. And obviously there's quite a bit of contradiction between them from various different faith traditions. So.
Yeah, I think there is an English, a British, maybe it's a British thing, I don't know, but certainly the churches that I went to, even the evangelical and some of the sort of other churches, the more sort of traditional churches, they did speak a lot about renewal of heaven and earth, and this idea of sort of being sort of like that sort of New Jerusalem idea, that image in the there's some old songs in sort of old English sort of hymns that speak about this a little bit, about sort of bringing Jerusalem to England, and there's all sorts of interpretations about what that means. But I think a lot of the sentiment in it is kind of this idea of creating sort of working on the project of restoring the earth to bring about the intended creation that God had. And I like that one of the priests described it to me, which I kind of like this idea. Obviously, I don't believe it to be true in the sense of it describes actually how the world is, but I like it as a kind of romantic idea of, when you experience something meaningful or worthwhile, whether it's he was talking about a sip of Guinness. I don't know if you guys get that drink, that sort of Irish stout. I love Guinness, and I think we were drinking Guinness when he said it to me, because I took him to the pub for a drink, and that sensation of having a sip of Guinness on a warm London evening, or hanging out with your friends, or a hug from your kid. These things for him were examples of heaven. They were kind of remnants, or if you like, of kind of the intended creation that God had in mind before Adam went and had one of his 5 a day off the tree of knowledge. So yeah, I kind of like that romantic idea, and that was very common. I didn't really come across the rapture, heavens, and a place out in the universe somewhere that we're going to get swept up into. I didn't ever come across that. It's not to say it doesn't exist, but it just wasn't something I bumped into much at all.
Interesting, man. I feel like we could talk forever. I just have a couple more topics that I know I need to.
No, you go for it. You ask as many questions as you like. I'm enjoying the sound of my own voice.
No, like maybe we'll have to have you back on for another round. So looking through the Bible, the other thing and the story of Jesus in particular, the other thing that struck me listening to you go through it was, again, what I found compelling as that teenager, and the character of Jesus is flipping everything on its head. And I think you talked to a few people as well that describe this, that, the Pharisees and the Sadducees of his day were the religious leaders. And ironically, they are the evangelicals of today, right? So the message is still just as poignant as it was then. And he was all about saying this is hypocritical to look as though you are good and then to truly not be that way in your heart, to just do things on the outside and be corrupt on the inside. That message was profound to me. And then what Jesus was talking about was, I've come for the sick and not for the well. This idea, that was the thing that struck me so much at that time. And I think you've met several people who really got that, some Christians who really kind of portray that. In the Grace episode, you go out and meet some homeless people and the people that work in that space, really trying to make a change in the world and reaching out to the poor and the needy.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a moment in the episode 5 where we're out on the street where I'm with the street pastors, which is like this movement in the UK. I think it's probably in the States as well. There's a version of it that started here in South London, and I think now there's sort of various versions of it all over the world. But some of the street pastors I'm with are just interacting with people in kind of, whether they're homeless or whether they're kind of, out in the town drinking and they're kind of like an absolute mess and they're drunk and that sort of stuff. And there's various moments along the way where you just see that, one of them, for example, was this woman called Brenda, who was the kind of leader. Was kind of shy in many ways. She wasn't really one of these, talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, like she wasn't really one of these Christians who would like knock your house down and sort of want to tell you about it.
Yeah.
She was someone who wanted to sort of just be seen or people to see Christianity through just what she did. And I often found those types of people more inspiring in some ways, the people who they don't brag about it, they just kind of get on with it and they kind of let their actions do the talking. There's a certain set of movements in the UK, like things like street pastors and a few other things that I came across where people are just talking about Christianity without really talking about it. They're doing of the gospel, I guess. Mm-hmm. And that idea of grace, I guess, that people getting something for nothing really plays into that for them, was my sort of take from interacting with those people. It's a real big thing for them. It does, regardless of who deserves something, you should get up and do something about it. I just kind of like that no nonsense approach to giving. I think I've worked in the voluntary sector and I've worked in charities and I've spent time in that world, and there's loads of good work. I'm not knocking it, but we are living in a world where people count the cost of even our giving, and you have to some extent. You can't be naive to think you can just keep on giving everything away, but there's a strand or thread within Christianity that doesn't. The first thing you do is not just means test the people that you're giving to,
right,
and check that they are the poorest person in the community to give it to. They just kind of get on with giving it. I kind of found that refreshing. Mm-hmm. To be amongst people that just kind of, there was times where they were helping people that you could argue they probably didn't even deserve help.
Right.
But that was an example to me of the fact that they were kind of blind to it. There was a nice naivety about what they were doing. You could argue that some of the stuff they were doing wasn't that sustainable. They were giving out sandwiches when, you could maybe do other things for homeless people that's maybe more
Sure.
sustainable. So you could critique it along the line, but the thing I took away was just their attitude towards it was something that I find was interesting to reflect on for myself. Was they just give without thinking about it because it's what you should do, which certainly isn't my approach to life. That's not how I am. I'm not that type of person. So to be around people like that was exposing for me, and also it was just nice to see that up close.
Yeah. Definitely. And again, there are many secular people who do wonderful things in the world, but it's harder to do that on your own, right? There's again, back to the infrastructure of just, something that helps you along to do good in the world and that kind of thing. I think you ran into several people, Christians, who were actually doing that.
Yeah, and I would also just want to bring up one other example, which I'm also in some ways struck by even more, because the example of street pastors in some ways is like a version of like the secular world, because it's like an initiative, and
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that the wider society does really well is initiatives. There's so many great non-religious initiatives to do things. One of the things I think that I was most struck by the Christian community is how the non-official community things that they do, so things that aren't sort of written down anywhere, or there's not an initiative behind them. One of the women who I speak to, Val, in episode 5, I think, she didn't break her leg, she had like bad knees, and so she was having an operation during the time that I'd been speaking to her and met her, and over the period of time. So she had a bunch of operations on her knees. So when she came out of hospital, because she's like this loved member of the church and she's a member of this community, they just coordinated themselves whereby she didn't have to cook for herself for 6 months. Yeah. So Val was getting meals sent to her house for, I think, something like 6 months after her operation. And they just went ahead and coordinated that amongst themselves. It's not an initiative. No one wrote a business plan. Nobody went out online and set up a Just Giving page or anything like that and did all the things that you might do in the secular world to drum up that type of stuff. They just kind of, because they're set up to do that, they've got WhatsApp groups and they've got Wednesday night meetings and all this sort of stuff. You're right. It's infrastructure and it's kind of community DNA. When someone's on their knees, literally in Val's case, they just rally around and do things like that, which I don't know about your life, but I my friends are great, but they don't send me meals when I'm having a hard time.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know how many people's friends do, but some of the Christians really close to where I live, there's this really strong community where they just kind of worked all that stuff out, which I was kind of struck by.
Okay, so second to last idea I want to get across is you also express, and again, I just commend you in the honesty and the humility in which you took on this project. But at times you do express some qualms. I think you used the term of bugs to swallow. What were some of the things that held you back from just doing what your atheist friend was afraid of, that, just fully embracing Christianity?
Yeah. Obviously, I think they fall into two areas. Like the obvious areas are just the belief bugs. They come thick and fast. Like to get through to meaning, or to get through to anything of value, you're like a motorcyclist on the motorway with your helmet up, and the bugs are just flying at you constantly. Yes. So if you open the Bible without a willingness to park your modern conceptions of how we arrive at truth in a sort of naturalistic sense, if you're not ready to do that, and if I hadn't prepared myself to do that, I would have stopped at the first hurdle. You wouldn't get past page one. I mean, I use words in the thing like bonkers and hocus pocus, and I jokingly use them, but I think parts of the Bible they're bonkers. I mean, the Christmas story, until you strip out the claims about what happened, it's a crazy story. It's as nuts as a fat man running around the world for 24 hours dumping presents down chimneys. And it's as unbelievable as that. So if you stop at that point, and if I'd stopped at that point, then it would all be bad. I mean, it would all be just like, this is just nonsense. Virgin births, shepherds or kings being led to barns in the night. All of that stuff is a real barrier to entry. For, I guess, for an independent thinker, or for someone who has been raised on a diet of, the way you find out about truth about the world from a natural perspective is through sort of scientific inquiry. Right. If that's your kind of method to which you think you find out whether stuff happens or how the physical world works, you're not going to get very far. And I wouldn't have got very far had I not come into it knowing that I was going to be faced with those bugs and they were going to come splatting onto my face. But I just made a commitment to say, and I say this in episode 1, I'm going to store them up in my cheeks. Yeah. And I'm just going to leave them there, because I don't think we get anywhere by letting those things derail us. So I made a commitment to sort of crack on. So there's the belief side of things, which is just thick and fast and all the time, just constantly in church. The stuff they're saying, everything about it is unbelievable in that sense.
Can I jump in here real quick?
Sure.
One of the things I was struck by, and I think I've learned over the last few years of talking to people in this space, is that, again, I came to Christianity as a 16, 17 year old, and I think that inoculized me just a little bit. I was definitely all in. I never want to portray that I wasn't all in. I was all in, but I still had mostly an adult brain that could filter through some of the things and say, well, maybe not that entirely. What I've been struck by is talking to people who grew up, particularly in theologically conservative environments, by which I mean not necessarily politically, but more a literalist interpretation of the Bible, where you mentioned Santa Claus, right? Well, they're, right next to Santa Claus, they're being taught about Jesus, and Jesus is real, even when Santa Claus has turned out to not be. As a child, you don't have the same critical thinking skills. You don't even have abstract thinking skills yet, right? You can't put those things together. And so I've been struck by the damage that can be done to children that somebody like yourself, or even me, who was a believer, but coming to it later in life, that you're able to filter through those things, right? You're able to say,
Yeah.
I can take what is good from this and leave what is not. And a child really can't do that.
Yeah. No, I think I share some of that, and it probably leads me on to sort of think about what, other than the belief, what other bits I found awkward. I guess it is linked to belief, but it plays out in a sort of more kind of everyday, or manifests itself in kind of language and other things that Christians do. That kind of ultimate idea of you're either in Jesus or you're not in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And to be a Christian is being all in, as you say. I kind of struggled with that. I think the last episode, I mean, it's not really a show that has spoilers. I wouldn't be flattering myself to say I have spoilers in my show. It's not Game of Thrones, but if there is something to be sort of kept until the end, I guess it's my final views on it. But I would share a little bit of that now, in so much as I think the in and outness of it is not a bug that I would have even enjoyed keeping in my mouth. I think Christianity's greatest strength is also, paradoxically, its greatest weakness in some ways. I think one of the lines that I wrote for the narration is something along the lines of, the thing that keeps people like me on the outside intellectually is also the thing that binds them together in the middle.
Yeah.
And I really came away with that idea that I think part of that in and outness is one of its strengths. Like, is one of the things that holds people together in the. I think people must like that in some way. Human nature, I think, likes that in some way, and that is one of the things that, as I do like, even though we, there's downsides, as you said earlier, to the kind of lack of the isolation you get as a non-believer, and I mourn the fact. I mourned a little bit the fact that I couldn't be a Christian.
Yeah.
But one of the fundamental reasons why I couldn't be is because I think I have an affinity to being an independent thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that you're all in on one idea or one person, it really doesn't sit easy with me at all. I think, I like the fact that for the show I get to dip in and come back as a different person, but ultimately I can go elsewhere. And I could go and read Seneca, or I could go and hang out with Muslims, or I could, go to a Sunday assembly and hang out with a bunch of atheists and genuinely give them the same time and thing, but ultimately always returning to myself. Hopefully not in an overly sort of self-centered way, but ultimately knowing that it's my job to curate these ideas and make them my own. Whereas a Christian, I don't think, could say that, because at the heart of it, there is a tension between your own identity and who you are, and you're always in Jesus, and it's not about you, it's about God, and God leads you, and that's an awkward relationship for me, which I don't think I ever got comfortable with.
Yeah, interesting. So last question, and you kind of just answered it, but I'd like you to just highlight a little bit more, and that is, so the stated purpose of the podcast is kind of to find meaning. And now you've experienced what it's like to try to find meaning in the Christian perspective. But for you personally, Tom, how do you find meaning?
Do you mean like as sort of outside of this, or like just
exactly. So you are a non-believer, and I think that one of the great questions in all of humanity is, how does one find purpose and meaning in life? And I'm just curious
Yeah.
what you do personally.
I think this comes with a health warning in so much as I think I've got a hopelessly bad response. I think one of the things that I've realized in hanging out with people with such a settled worldview, like Christians have, they've got a framework and they've got and the criticism is, I think it's a fair criticism, that's maybe overly rigid, and it's very, very well established, and the lines they've drawn for themselves are very bright and obvious. I, on the other hand, am this kind of like mess of like little bits of ideas that I picked up over the years, and I'm just an absolute scrambled mess of things. And now I've got to chuck Christianity in there because I've just gone away and spent a bunch of time doing it. So that's like, it's a burden rather than a good thing in some ways, because now I've got to incorporate that into my thinking. I don't have a good idea of what I have as a worldview. As a plug for series 2, I'll be thinking about other things that can maybe help me shape that, maybe things around politics and things like that, because I think I'm hopelessly unengaged. I think it's the thing I've realized.
Interesting.
And of course I've read some stuff, and I did a science degree at university, and so I'm naturally, when I think about how the world is from a physical perspective, my worldview is, that's how we arrive at ideas for describing, physical things like nature and trees and plants and universes and atoms and quarks and all that sort of stuff. I'm sort of probably all in on that, but I think that only takes you to the point of kind of describing the world around you. I think, for me, I don't buy into the idea that then science can make a jump into then how it tells me how to treat my kids.
Right.
I'm much more, I think, as a new father, I've got 2 kids under 3. Do you have kids, David?
I do. Yeah, I've got, they're teenagers, but yeah.
Right. Okay. So you fully know the kind of, the game changer that is and the impact it has on you.
Absolutely.
I think I'm much more aware of how much I use my instinct and my wits, which have been informed by ideas and worldviews and things like that. But I often dig deep into sort of like personal reserves of patience and things, and just try and find inspiration for those capacities as much as I can.
Right.
Patience and sort of self-sacrifice is something I'm not particularly good at. And as a dad with 2 young kids at home, you've got to get good at that quick.
Yeah.
And so I think if I to get to an answer, hopefully in my rambling answer, you understand my answer, because I don't really have a good worldview. But I think I identify some of the things I know I need to work on, like patience and self-sacrifice, and you just name anything that you probably want to be as a person, and I try and find ways to resource that. So whether that's reading something interesting, maybe reading a bit of philosophy, I'm a podcast fiend, so I'll listen to a bunch of stuff. I'll watch Les Mis, a 6-part series, and come away and feel inspired, and just try and build that into the things that I've identified that I think I probably need to work on, which is, it's probably how I run my life day to day. So I'm not an overly grand thinker about that sort of stuff, but what I hope in this series and future series of Hiding in Plain Sight is that I'll start to maybe form some more interesting shapes around those ideas a little bit.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the honest answer. I think the search itself, in many ways, can be the source of meaning. Just the questioning. So I had Jennifer Michael Hecht, who wrote Doubt: A History, on just the previous podcast, and she talked about that the great believers and great doubters have a lot in common because they've done the questioning, as far as that, as differentiated from the middle, who has never considered the question at all. Right.
Yeah, right. I'm probably somewhere in that middle, sort of working my way through the crowd.
Okay. Well, I want to give you an opportunity to, let's plug your show. How can people get in touch with you, and how can they find your podcast?
So yeah, I love hearing from people. This is a new thing to me. I'm not a professional podcaster or anything like that. I'm sort of, I'm a enthusiastic amateur. So, just set up on Twitter. So you can tweet me. I'm at Tom Hips Podcast. So everything's Hips because obviously Hiding in Plain Sight, HIPS. So that's where that comes from for memory. So that's also the website if you want to check that out, hipspodcast.com. So you can check out all the episodes on there or in your podcast player. I think we're in every podcast player, mostly like Stitcher and Spotify and iTunes and all that stuff. So check out there. You can also listen to the music, and you can read the lyrics of the music. So we made all our own music for the podcast, which people can buy and listen to listen to for free on wherever you get your music from. So that's also pretty cool. And then finally, you can email me. So I've been excited to be getting emails from people, and people sharing their story, Christians, and especially, I would say this: I've had less stuff from non-believers.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm really keen to start getting some abuse. So send me stuff that you don't like about it, because I'm interested in. I'm sure the show there must be things that jar with people. And as you can probably imagine, I think from the tone of the show, which is quite positive, and I've deliberately, unapologetically searched for value. Mm-hmm. Christians have said lots of nice things, but I'm really interested in if any of your listeners listen to it and maybe there's things they want to ask me. I'm going to do some Q&A episodes. So email me at tom@hipspodcast.com.
Well, you heard it. Send the abuse to Tom.
Absolutely.
I also want to just say that you're being falsely humbled there. The podcast is incredibly well produced. You produced your own music. It is very, very well done. I highly recommend the podcast. We'll definitely have the links in the show notes. So everybody needs to go check this out. Hiding in Plain Sight. Tom, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, I appreciate it, Dave. Thanks. Great to talk to you.
Some final thoughts on the episode. I'm not sure we do justice to just how good the Hiding in Plain Sight podcast is. You must check it out. Again, that's hipspodcast.com, hipspodcast.com. We will have links in the show notes. Tom, as you heard, is an honest seeker. He approached this project with humility and sincerity, which comes across in each of his episodes. I'm very curious to hear from you what you think of the Hiding in Plain Sight podcast. For the believers who listen, you're hearing an honest person describe how they perceive Christianity, giving it a real try, giving it an honest evaluation. And for atheists, do you think that Tom went too far? Do you think he gave it too much credit? As he mentions at the end there, he's looking for some feedback from the secular community. So please get in touch with him. What I love about the premise of his podcast, and what is ultimately the premise of this podcast, is the search for meaning. Sometimes the search itself is the source of meaning. As I've mentioned before, the idea of secular grace and humanism has resolved a lot of those questions for me personally. I assert that humanity and human beings individually have value and dignity, and that inspires me to show love to people in the world. But as Tom and I discussed, there isn't the same infrastructure for secular people to do good works, as it were, in the same way that the church has. There also isn't always the same level of motivation. So the questions that I leave with you are, how can we motivate one another, spur each other on to good works? How can we collectively join one another to make an impact in the world? Remember, humanism is people. Humanism is you. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist. Or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.